everybody. Welcome. Happy New Year. Happy Year of the Rat. So we're very happy to have today our first colloquium of 2021, kicking off with Alyssa Battistoni of Harvard. We're really looking forward to her presentation. So thanks to everyone for coming. Thank you, Alyssa. Just one quick announcement. Thanks to the speakers committee. One quick announcement, in 2 weeks, we have Mary Thomas from Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, as you saw, the juvenile prison. So I hope to see you back in 2 weeks. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Joel.
Thank you, Darla. Pleasure to be here today with all of you. Thank you for coming to the 5th event in our ongoing series, A World on Edge. It's my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Alyssa Battistoni, who I regard as one of the most urgent and important voices working today in the US on the politics and theory of our climate emergency. After taking her bachelor's degree in political science from Stanford University, Alyssa completed her master's degree initially at the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford University, and then moved to Yale, where she completed a master's and a PhD in political theory, focusing on the political theory of humans and the environment, or nature. From Yale, Alyssa moved to Harvard, where she's presently doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for the Environment. But I just learned this morning that she will be taking up a position at Barnard College later this year in, again, political theory. But meanwhile, aside from all this academic work, over the past decade, Alyssa has been very actively engaged in writing for public audiences about politics and climate change, especially, in a long list of magazines and websites, journals, and blogs, which I won't list for you now, but if you go to her website, you can see some of the many things which she's published online. And she also serves on the editorial boards of Jacobin and Science for the People, which are two of the more prominent outlets to emerge here on the left from social movement organizations that emerged since the time of Occupy Wall Street. And meanwhile, in 2019, Alyssa published her first book, which is called A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, with Verso. That book is co-authored with Kate Aronoff, Daniel Cohen, and Thea Rio Francos. And presently, Alyssa is writing her next book, which is entitled Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. So I think you can get a sense of why I'm so excited to hear Alyssa's talk today, which is entitled Zero Carbon Democracy, ? State and Capital in the Age of Climate Change. Thanks for being here, Alyssa.
Well, thank you so much, Joel, for that very generous introduction. Thank you to the Geography Department for inviting me. And thank you to everyone spending your Friday afternoon on Zoom. I know we're all zoomed out at this point, so I really do appreciate it. I'm really excited to talk through this with all of you. It's sort of a more theoretical consideration of some of the work I've done around things like the Green New Deal, as Joel mentioned, and trying to think through these big topics in the title of the talk, State, Climate, and Capital. And so I'll just sort of dive right in if I can share my screen, which hopefully I can do. Okay, is that working? Everyone can see my screen?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay, super. Okay, so I'll just get to the point and start my outlining my argument. So in short, I start from the assumption that capitalism is the central driver of climate change and other ecological crises, so that we eventually and ultimately must move beyond it. And another assumption is that the urgency of the climate crisis means that we have to work with many things that we have that we may eventually want to move beyond. So in short, I'm making the case for using the state to decarbonize within capitalism while ultimately seeking to move beyond it. And when I say the state here, and I reference the state in the abstract throughout, but I'm really focusing on what are usually referred to as capitalist democracies, even if we think that might be an oxymoron in some respects. In any case, as noted, might be conditions under which something like the Green New Deal might, projects that seek to advance decarbonization within capitalist democracies, sort of what their possibilities and challenges are at a more theoretical level. So to start off, why use the state? First, the set of distinctive capacities the state has, I think, are ones that we need to use. Many of the things we need to do to decarbonize are things that I think only the state can do at scale, whether that's whether that's building out new infrastructures or providing low carbon public goods like housing and transportation. Capital investment shapes the world we live in quite literally, and only the state can really challenge private capital in that regard. Second, the state's coercive capacity is the only way of restricting fossil capital and other carbon intensive industries at scale, whether through regulation, outright nationalization, moratoriums on extraction, and so on. Conversely, the fact that state coercive power presently poses a threat to climate movements, to movements that work against fossil capital, I think is itself a reason to engage it. Whether or not you're interested in the state, it's interested in you. And finally, the specifically territorial authority of the state makes it particularly important as a mediator between abstract capital and concrete nature. The state capital roams the earth in search of returns. Natural processes happen in specific concrete places and times. When capital touches down, whether to drill an oil well or build a wind turbine, it has to go through the state. So I'm going to come back to these at the end after some meandering through theoretical terrain, but I wanted to lay that out concretely at the start. And the second is simply a matter of time. We have a very short timeline with which to drastically cut carbon emissions if we're to prevent catastrophic climate change or more catastrophic climate change, since I think we are already on track for fairly catastrophic climate effects. They can always get worse is one of my mottos. And so I think that is a reason to engage with the state more or less as it is now, even as we seek to transform it in the future, using the state now in order to buy time for more transformative projects in the future. And here I agree with Jeff Mann's argument for engaging the state in his 2013 book, Disassembly Required, that current levels of carbon emission and biodiversity loss may rule out a human long run if we do not put the tools at hand to work immediately and effectively. One of those tools being the state, which Mann also has a critique of course, that he'll develop and has worked with Joel. So sort of the very basic outline of my argument for why I think we need to use the state. I want to address the two main objections because a lot of the talk will be really trying to work through some of those objections. And the first is sort of an argument from normative or moral grounds, often arguing against sovereignty in particular as a concept, as a way of arranging political communities or designating political authority. And I'm just going to not say very much about that here because my argument is not an argument about a just state, an ideal state. It's not ideal theory. And I also don't think that for the purposes of this argument, an argument about the just nature of the state is necessary. So I'm going to sort of I want to recognize those arguments, but just say that they're not going to be my focus here. Where I really am focusing is on sort of the arguments that whether you want the state to act or not, it's not going to, or it's not capable of addressing ecological problems in general and climate change in particular. And here, both ecological and Marxist thinkers, two groups amongst which I count myself, have typically been very harsh critics of the nation state. Ecological critics have long pointed out that ecological processes and problems don't respect national boundaries or state sovereignty. Marxists argue that states tend to operate for the benefits of capital, sorry, the doorbell rang, rather than the people who they claim to represent. Globalization and climate change have brought these critiques ever closer together. Today, both capital accumulation and atmospheric processes or the human transformation of atmospheric processes are occurring on a planetary scale. Thus, many charge that the territorially bounded nation state simply can't hope to grapple with either. It's particularly true if you think that capitalism is sort of a driving force of climate change. If the state has to confront capital to stave off ecological destruction, the state would have to confront capital to stave off ecological destruction. But in fact, the state acts to facilitate capital accumulation. Thus, as Joshua Clover argues about the Green New Deal, it's not going to happen. It's simply not what the state is for or what it does. So I will just say I agree with many of these critiques, probably most of them. I agree that the challenges are very daunting. But so far, I simply have yet to see a convincing argument for an alternative. And without, I have yet to see a convincing argument for an alternative. So anti-state critics tend to call for revolutionary movements against both state and capital, but admit that they're extremely unlikely, if not outright utopian. So while Mann and Wainwright outline a strong and compelling critique of the realism of those who seek no option but the nation state in their book, Climate Leviathan, I think we must be pragmatic while simultaneously seeking to push the boundaries of what's realistic. And here I agree with Andreas Malm, who argues that although we have every reason to believe that the capitalist state will not take the steps required, quote, there is no other form of state on offer. All we have to work with is the dreary bourgeois state tethered to the circuits of capital as always. We may not like it, but we had better figure out what we can do with it. So although that's sort of my position, I also take, I think we should really take these criticisms to heart. And I really want to examine more closely the question they raise. What are the prospects for using the democratic state against fossil capital? And that's probably a bigger question that I can answer in a single lecture, but I want to begin to answer it and to approach it by drawing on two Marxist debates and trying to put them in conversation. So first, the central debate of eco-Marxism, what is the relationship between capitalism and nature? And second, the central debate of Marxist state theory, that being what is the relationship between capitalism and the state? And I'm going to try to put those in conversation to explore the interaction between these three terms, capital, state, and nature, and sort of see where that gets us. I draw in particular on the work of James O'Connor and as providing a potential bridge between these debates. O'Connor articulates a relationship between state, nature, and capital, and articulates a view of what that might mean for the kinds of struggles we look to. I also seek to clarify some ambiguities in his work, which I think have important implications for my purposes. And then I'm going to come back around at the end to kind of a more concrete reflection on the kinds of state transformation that I think are necessary in the present moment, and some of those social forces that I think might be pointing that direction, even if, again, it's a significant uphill battle. So I'll start with a question of capital and nature. How does capitalism relate to nature? Marx himself is rarely thought of as an ecological thinker, but his sparse remarks on non-human nature have by now been quite well documented. So it's often noted that Marx observed that capitalism robs both the worker and the soil, that labor is the father of wealth and the earth its mother, leaving aside the sort of gendered connotations of that. He saw a role for sort of earthly production in the production of wealth, not only a valorization of labor. And eco-Marxists have sought to articulate more precisely the place of nature in capitalism. So most, I would say, tend to agree that, that capitalism tends to destroy what we might think of as sort of ecological nature. It digs up the earth in search of raw materials for production, converts biodiverse forests to high yield plantations, treats the atmosphere as dumping ground for waste and pollution, including excess carbon dioxide. But where eco-Marxists tend to diverge, or at least one of the central arguments that I want to focus on here, is the question of whether this destructive tendency constitutes a crisis for capitalism. That is, does the ecological destruction caused by capitalism affect profitability and processes of capital accumulation? Or do those ecological crises, however devastating they may be for non-human life and human life, particularly humans who are dependent more directly on non-human nature through perhaps subsistence production, whether that has no direct consequences for capital accumulation. And so those are sort of the two poles, and I'm going to go through each of those. So the first is the sort of neo-Polanyian approach, which sees capitalism's tendency to destroy nature as also self-destructive. So Karl Polanyi had argued for seeing land as a fictitious commodity, which was not produced for sale, but was in a market society nevertheless bought and sold. And he argued that once land was bought and sold, it would be destroyed. Quote, nature would be reduced to its elements, neighborhoods and landscapes defiled, rivers polluted, and so on. And this in turn would lead to a crisis for market society itself, since market society needed this thing, land, which it didn't produce and which it tended to destroy. So James O'Connor, a sociologist, would later redescribe fictitious commodities as what he called capitalism's conditions of production. Again, these being elements which are not produced according to capitalism's law of value, but which are nevertheless utilized by capitalism as part of production. He thought these included things like ecosystemic viability, ozone levels, soil, air, and water quality, and various other ecological background conditions. And like Polanyi, O'Connor argued that when these elements are treated as commodities, they're degraded, exhausted, and run down. Capitalism tends to destroy its conditions of production, which in turn poses a threat to capitalism himself. And O'Connor described this tendency as the second contradiction of capitalism. The first contradiction was is usually just thought of as the classic contradiction of capitalism, wherein productivity increases make it possible for capital to produce more with fewer workers, but as fewer workers receive wages, demand collapses. There's a problem of overproduction, too many goods, and not enough consumers. Commodities go unpurchased, and capital can't realize the value of its investment. So if that's the first contradiction is a contradiction caused by a problem of demand, the second contradiction is a crisis sort of on the supply side. By degrading the social and environmental conditions of production, capital inadvertently increases its own costs and undercuts its own profits. So we might think, for example, of a situation where rising temperatures caused by excessive carbon concentration in the atmosphere produce droughts, which result in bad harvests, causing the cost of food and therefore labor power to rise. And as with the traditional crisis of overproduction, these ecological come economic crises are endemic to capitalism, but also generative for it. So they could lead to a restructuring of the ecological conditions of production so that they could remain available in perpetuity, often involving state action, and I'll say more about this in a minute. But for an example, the forestry department might institute permanent yield forests to ensure a steady supply of timber. A city choked by traffic congestion might undertake urban planning to ease commutes, and so on. Ecological crises might also drive capital to innovate technologically so that it used raw materials more efficiently, or to undertake a spatial fix, relocating production from one area where ecological conditions had been exhausted to another where they hadn't. And O'Connor also draws an important distinction that I want to highlight here because it'll be important going forward, between the conditions of production, which capital needs, and the means of life, which are not necessarily useful to capital, but which are necessary for human and non-human life more generally. O'Connor himself often conflates the two, or at least suggests that they go together. But I think it's important to disaggregate them, since perhaps all conditions of production are also means of life, but not all means of life are also conditions of production. So not every human being also is a source of labor power, and not everything that a human being needs to live is also thus producing a laborer who will go to work in production. So this has been a pretty influential thesis. Recent thinkers in the O'Connoran vein include Nancy Fraser and Jason Moore, although they both have their own sort of developments of this idea. But the other camp questions whether ecological crisis really does portend a crisis for capitalism. And for sort of the main critics here, John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett, the central flaw in O'Connor's thesis is the disjuncture between ecological and economic crises. So they argue there is no feedback mechanism that would serve to translate ecological degradation, even on a planetary level, into economic crises, demanding an immediate response on the part of capital. O'Connor's view of capitalism's relationship to nature, they think, is overly functionalist. Capital may need to preserve certain ecological conditions, like a minimally habitable planet, and certain forms of production may require specific conditions. So agricultural production requires a certain level of soil fertility, but not all ecological crises are also capitalist crises. Not all means of life are conditions of production. And so in short, ongoing capital accumulation might be compatible with levels of ecological degradation that are devastating to both human and non-human life. I'll just say here that it is true that so far ecological crisis doesn't seem to have undermined the general prospects for capital accumulation. Although thinkers from the liberal economist Larry Summers to the Marxist economist Robert Brenner point to the phenomenon of secular stagnation, the slowing rate of growth. The cause is not the high cost of ecological goods, resource scarcity, or destruction of value by volatile planetary phenomenon, but the lack of investment opportunities promising adequate rates of return. Meanwhile, capital seems perfectly capable of weathering many storms, from climate-fueled hurricanes devastating much of the Caribbean, cyclones and typhoons killing thousands in Myanmar, the Philippines, and Mozambique, many other disasters afflicting human and non-human life, which have hardly registered as a blip to capital. That could obviously change as climate conditions worsen, but it suggests at the very least we shouldn't underestimate capitalism's ability to function in the face of mass death and destruction. So I'll come back to this question in a moment, but for now, I want to turn to the state. And so, again, here, if the central point of contention in sort of eco-Marxist debates is concerns the relationship of nature and capital, the central debate in Marxist state theory regards the relationship of state and capital. Big surprise there. In general, what Marxist state theorists I think tend to agree on is on a critique of, when we think of critiques of bourgeois theories of the state. They argue that the state can't simply be seen as either an autonomous institution with its own sort of logic and ends, per a Weberian concept of the state, nor as a simple expression of the general will, as in various democratic theories, nor as a neutral terrain in which any set of interests may contest for state power and seek to wield that power towards their own ends, as in pluralist models, popular and political science around mid-century, mid-20th century. Instead, the modern state has to be understood as specific to capitalist society, structured by class relations, and oriented towards stabilizing capital accumulation, upon which it itself depends for revenue. The state reflects the separation of the economic and political in capitalism, wherein economic production is set apart from other forms of political decision-making allocated to a private realm. At the same time, the state does things that capital itself cannot, provides the conditions of production, including things like legal relationships, governing property ownership, the guarantee of fiat money, provision of infrastructure and public goods necessary but unprofitable for private investors, and so on. Just many other things as well. I won't go into all of them. But I think most theorists would also agree that to varying degrees the state mediates between the interests of individual capitalists, whether sort of distinct between the capitalists in different industries, for example, between the interests of fossil fuel and renewable energy producers, or competing producers within the same industry. Resolves tensions between short-term and long-term interests of capital accumulation, for example, between the immediate profitability of drilling oil as quickly as possible or long-term exhaustion of the resource. It might reserve capitalist crises by, for example, stepping in to provide liquidity amidst a financial crisis or reducing interest rates to facilitate investment. So I think there's a lot that's shared, although different state theorists have different accounts of what exactly the state is, how exactly it relates to capitalism, and the relationships of capitalism. And here, instead of breaking the debate along the usual lines, it's usually sort of broken down into different tendencies. So there's like a instrumentalist view associated with Ralph Miliband, a structuralist view associated with Nikos Poulantzas, and a state derivation tradition associated with John Holloway. I want to point to what I see as a key fault line, or as a useful sort of distinguishing factor for my argument. And so I'm going to make a distinction between views which position the state as primarily functional for capital and those which take a more contradictory view of the state. I'll note no one describes their own theory as functionalist, although many Marxist state theorists describe each other's theories as functionalist. I'm sure it's not a description that perhaps anyone would accept of their own. But what I want to get at here is a question of whether there's a possibility that the state might be used towards non-capitalist ends. And a more functionalist account, the state is a distinctively capitalist state whose primary function is to facilitate capital accumulation. It may not succeed in those aims. An attempt to stimulate the economy may fail due to underlying conditions. The state may not be able to overcome the underlying contradictions of capital. But it's also, we shouldn't expect it to act in ways that are counterposed to the interests of capital. In more contradictory accounts, the state is subject to countervailing pressures. It may act in ways that don't directly serve the interests in capital in particular or in general. This doesn't mean that the state doesn't still carry out necessary functions or functions necessary for capital accumulation. This is also compatible with a view of the state as weighted in the interests of capital, dependent again on capital accumulation for its own continuation, and so on. But there is at least a possibility that the state will act in non-capitalist ways. So I want to put these two terms together and here return to O'Connor and who brings state, capital, and nature together most explicitly. And recall that for O'Connor, nature constitutes something which is a condition of production, something not produced by capitalism, but which capital therefore can't rely on the market to provide. So if the market won't provide this condition of production, of which nature and ecological conditions are one component, then it's the state, he argues, that manages capital's access to those conditions of production, and in some instances produces the conditions of production directly. So, for example, the state regulates capital's access to sources of raw materials through the allocation, for example, of mining permits, or it produces labor power by providing public education. On the other hand, the state also deals with things that capital produces but doesn't need. So things like, for example, pollution and other what economists would call negative externalities. In some cases, the state spends money to address these social and ecological harms. In other cases, it might institute regulations to prevent the most egregious forms. But in any case, O'Connor argues the state places itself between capital and nature, or mediates capital and nature, with the immediate result that the conditions of capitalist production are politicized. Every state agenda and political party agenda may be regarded as a kind of interface between capital and nature. So I think this draws attention to the importance of political struggles in thinking about how this relationship of capital and nature unfolds. And taking this view of the state as an essential mediator between capital and nature, I want to consider different ways that we might expect the state to act based on how we understand the relationship on the one hand between capital and nature, and on the other, capital and the state. And And in this next section, I'm going to take some inspiration from Mann Wainwright's chart in Climate Leviathan, outlining theirs outlines various configurations of planetary sovereignty and capitalism. Here, I'm going to sort of put these different views of state and nature, state and capital, and nature and capital into conversation. And hopefully the schematic, however rough, is clarifying in some ways. So here we have across the top the two positions I've outlined with respect to capital and nature, and then this vertical column, two positions I've outlined with respect to capital and the state. So I'll start on the left, sort of left hand of the actual chart, not the sort of labels, but within this. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right here, this top left quadrant. So in general, this column takes the Burkett and Foster position on nature, wherein capital destroys nature, but not itself. From their account, I think we can surmise that state intervention to protect ecosystems, stabilize atmospheric conditions, and so on. This wouldn't be an this wouldn't be an instance of the state stepping in to protect capitalism for itself, for example. It wouldn't be the state stepping in to protect ecological conditions, does not constitute a protection of the conditions of production. Since capital doesn't actually need many aspects of non-human nature, doesn't actually suffer consequences from its destruction. Rather, state action to prevent ecological and social crises would constitute action against capital, a limitation on its destructive tendencies, undertaken not in its own interest, whether short or long term, but in the interest of human and non-human life, what we might think of as the means of life. So if we think the state is entirely functional for capital, we can conclude that the state's not going to do that. The state's not going to act to protect ecosystems and human life from climate catastrophe. Down in this corner, with a logic that goes sort of, the state will only act to preserve capital accumulation. Ecological destruction does not threaten capital accumulation. Therefore, the state will not act to address ecological destruction. I think this is essentially the position of Clover. I mentioned Joshua Clover's argument against the Green New Deal earlier, and others like Jasper Burns, Martin Arboleda, and others working in the tradition of state derivation theory. If the state's relationship to capital is contradictory, as we see in this top left corner, then it's at least possible to imagine a state acting to preserve human and non-human means of life, even where they're not also conditions of production. That is at least possible to imagine the state acting in non-capitalist ways and even against the interests of capital in service of ecological and social well-being. So now let's turn to the right-hand column, where we are, this is reflecting the sort of O'Connorian view of nature and capital, wherein the destruction of nature is also self-destructive. So in this case, we would expect that we would interpret state action to prevent catastrophic climate change as action to save capitalism from itself, to limit its self-destructive tendencies in the service of continued accumulation. So if the state is functional for capital, we might expect it to, as we would see down here in the top or the bottom right corner, we'd expect the state to act to preserve the conditions of production for capital, although potentially in quite narrow ways. So perhaps the state would undertake carbon removal projects to permit ongoing oil extraction and combustion, or invest in new drought-resistant crops, or undertake geoengineering projects to protect its agricultural sector. We would maybe expect action in ways that are defending these sort of conditions of production against self-destructive tendencies, but in relatively narrow ways that don't also go beyond into the means of life that are not useful to capital. The state is contradictory by contrast. We might still expect that state action against climate change is in the service of preserving the conditions of production and saving capitalism from itself, But I think there are also more possibilities here that the state will also act in ways that don't only serve the interest in capital, that can also address the means of life that are subject to various forms of struggle. And I think that this is probably around where O'Connor's own position lands. In any case, we have these 4 possibilities. And I just want to note here that I think the only quadrant in which we would expect that the state will not act at all to stave off sort of climate catastrophe in any respect is this bottom quadrant here. And I think this position is hard to square with the fact that the state is neither omniscient nor omnipotent, and with historical evidence that it doesn't, that it does act in ways that don't immediately facilitate capital accumulation. I actually think that some responses to the COVID-19 crisis provide some evidence for contradiction, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. But in any case, I think this position should require a pretty high burden of proof, since its proponents admit that the alternative strategies of escaping state and capital, often by developing truly autonomous forms of provision, are extremely unlikely. So I'm going to focus on the possibilities of what happens with a contradictory state in my remaining time, seen in this upper half of the chart here. And here I want to combine O'Connor's attention to the state as playing a crucial mediating role between nature and capital, with sort of later Poulantzas's attention to the state as a contradictory entity, both constituted and riven by class conflict, including conflict amongst fractions of capital. So Nikos Poulantzas, I put early Poulantzas more in the sort of functional camp on state, because I think some of his earlier more structuralist work does have a more functional view of the state. But in his later work, I think it takes a more contradictory turn. So Poulantzas's major contribution is to analyze the state as a social relation. In one phrase, the state constitutes, quote, the material condensation of a relation of forces between classes and fractions of class. He saw class struggle and contradiction as internal to the state as both reflecting class struggle and constituting the terrain on which that struggle continued. And the state itself as a force for both organizing and disorganizing classes. So here I might think of something like Stuart Hall's famous example of the Thatcher right to buy policy, allowing people living in public housing and council housing to eventually purchase their home, in which case the state effectively organizes working class people to identify with capital by becoming homeowners. The state is, in any case, not monolithic, but fissured and often contradictory. Its branches liable to quarrel amongst each other. And Poulantzas argued that the aim of left movements should neither be to take over the state as it is and redeploy it as if it's sort of a neutral instrument, nor to destroy and replace the state entirely with an entirely separate form of governance, but to sharpen the internal contradictions of the state and to transform the state. For this, it's not possible to simply work within the state by, say, winning state power through elections, but to build social forces and intensify struggle beyond it. So here I'm going to pose a couple of questions. First, where do struggles over environment or climate fit into this vision of a state that's riven and constituted by class struggle? And second, how might these forces seek to transform the state in service of climate action, and what kind of climate action? So, all right, so environmental movements have typically been discussed as one of a number of new social movements that emerged in the 1960s, treated as distinct from traditional class-based movements like labor unions or labor parties. And they've been the subject of much theorizing from this, trying to figure out how they relate to traditional left-wing movements. Many have dismissed new social movements. Many Marxists and left thinkers have dismissed new social movements as non-class-based movements. Poulantzas, however, argued they had a role to play in left-wing efforts to transform the state. He thought the left could defend itself from reactionary forces that were sure to emerge by building a broad base of popular support. And he thought they could do that by adopting what he called new popular demands on fronts that used to wrongly be called secondary: women's struggles, the ecological movement, and so on. There are a number of other places Poulantzas frequently observes in his later work that these movements, these kinds of movements, usually naming women's struggles, ecological movement, and so on, as shouldn't be called secondary, that the relationship of primary and secondary movements should be rethought, and that there needed to be a role for these movements in thinking about class struggle in the state, but he never quite articulated what exactly that role should be or analyzed them further, and typically tended to treat them as sort of standing apart from the traditional class-based union and party. So here I also find O'Connor's view helpful. He argued for a different view of new social movements entirely, one that connected them more closely to class struggles. So first of all, he noted that all environmental movements have class dimensions. The burden of waste and pollution, for example, is disproportionately borne by working class people. We should add racialized people, as environmental justice movements have pointed out. And even where those dimensions aren't foregrounded in movements, environmental movements are important actors in this question of determining how the state grants capital access to nature or not, and on what conditions. So ecological struggles, that is, constitute struggles over the conditions of production, even where they're not naming themselves as explicitly anti-capitalist. So even a traditional conservation movement, usually seen as the province of sort of middle-class environmentalism, might serve to limit capital's access to the conditions of production. Ecological struggles are therefore better thought of as a broadening of class struggle rather than a tangent to it. They are, as O'Connor put it, not less but more than class issues. In turn, they're crucial, I think, to understanding the balance of forces that comprises state power per Poulantzas. But I also want to offer a corollary to O'Connor's argument, which is that we should think of struggles over environment not only as in part class issues, but also recognize that nature is also present in other forms of class struggle. In short, I want to resist the reification of environment as a separate sphere of activity and reject the classification of environmental movements and their demands as entirely distinct from other kinds. Okay, so if one question is sort of what are the forces that we might see as undertaking the struggle, another is what how exactly the state might be transformed. And while Poulantzas himself tended to discuss this in terms of more the sort of structure of politics and what kinds of democratic forms the state might take, I want to talk more concretely about what kinds of things the state might do. And in this part, I'm going to be turning more to the sort of current conjuncture, taking my examples from the US, but I think some of them at least will be applicable elsewhere. And the key question here, I think, is not whether there will be a response to climate change, but what kind of response there will be. And because climate change is so often framed as a sort of apocalypse where we're all in the same boat, we're all in it together, I find Gramsci's concept of hegemony particularly helpful, particularly useful here. So hegemony for Gramsci describes the phenomenon where the interests of a particular class come to appear as a general interest. I think then a major question with respect to decarbonization is whose interests are really served in action to save the world from catastrophic climate change, and in particular, whether the interests of green capital or the low carbon working class come to appear as a general interest. We might think, does subsidizing Elon Musk's Tesla factory seem like the way to save the world from climate change, or does saving the world seem to require building out electrified, energy efficient public housing and transportation for everyone to use? Poulantzas argued that the state played a crucial role in producing hegemony and mediating between class interests so that the interests of one class appeared as the general interest. And so in considering how the struggle for hegemony might play out on the terrain of the fractious terrain of the state, I think important questions to consider are questions about what that balance of forces look like and what kinds of transformations they might seek. So what are the tensions amongst fractions of capital and what are the potential social forces pushing against it? How does the state work to organize or disorganize these forces? I also want to consider, in considering the concrete possibilities for transforming the state, I also want to follow Amna Akbar in emphasizing the significance of non-reformist reforms, that is, reforms undertaken in service of more transformative futures, reforms which build power rather than simply implementing policy, and which live in the sort of dialectic between radical imagination and the concrete work of power building. So when we think about climate change, I think the added challenge is how to build political power in ways that also cut carbon, which I think is also a crucial component of sort of the terrain before us. The likelihood of longer term transformation really rests on whether we can have that longer term, what the longer term looks like, what the prospects for our longer term look like. And I think the worse the climate crisis, the steeper the road to justice. So, so how can we combine these challenges, building power, cutting carbon? And here, and just sort of getting a little more concrete, I'm gonna go back to the sort of two state functions that I emphasized at the beginning of the talk. States sort of powers of investment or what I've talked about as provision of conditions of production, and its coercive powers. So how can we transform state investment, or what would we want? How would we want to transform state investment? I think there's two components here. One is stopping the current state support for the conditions of production for fossil capital, investment in fossil fuel intensive infrastructure and so on. So, so there's a sort of piece about what we're moving away from, and then directing the state to provide not only the conditions of production for green capital, which is I think the direction we are going, but also for maintaining the means of life. So to begin, the state presently builds and maintains infrastructure for carbon intensive transportation, highways and airports, mediates fossil capital's access to fossil fuel reserves by issuing permits for oil, gas, and coal extraction, subsidizes fossil fuel exploration, development, and use, does many other things to facilitate the work of fossil capital. It also acts through inaction by not regulating the emissions of carbon and CO2 equivalents into what we might think was the public good of the atmosphere. So there's a lot of that, obviously, where all of that has to stop is the first piece. And then the sort of question of how the state redirects investment powers, and also sort of the mediating role of permitting and so on into to a set of infrastructures that can make use of renewable energy rather than fossil fuels. This is second. I just want to note that this investment, this kind of public investment in decarbonizing, obviously has a cost character, can be oriented towards, again, the conditions of production for green capital accumulation or the means of life, people's needs, whether or not that they're useful to capital. Should obviously be skeptical of the idea of green capitalism in general. Renewable energies have their own environmental and social costs. And I think that capitalism's fundamental devaluation of nature will persist even under a new energetic regime. But if capitalism needs cheap energy, I'm not sure it has to come in the form of fossil fuels. If capital appropriates nature, it could appropriate the free gifts of sun and wind rather than the stored up solar energy contained in fossil fuels. In any case, the present flow of capital into renewable energy presents new challenges and opportunities, and here, as ever, states play an important mediating role. So I think decarbonization investment led by green capital might mean things like issuing permits for installation of solar and wind power by private producers, building out charging stations for electric vehicles, and instituting tax credits for consumers who buy electric vehicles. For example, to support GM's recent announcement that it's going to invest in all electric vehicles, providing subsidies for corporate R&D or tax credits for manufacturers, and so on. By contrast, I think a working class led and oriented investment would direct state investment towards providing low carbon means of life, whether or not there are also conditions of production, in ways that strengthen the position of working class movements in the future. So for example, building energy efficient, electrified, low carbon public housing near public transportation, seeking to facilitate collective consumption and public luxury rather than encouraging demand for private consumption. More generally, providing public goods and services which make possible a low carbon way of going about daily life. So we have the sort of Tesla factory on the one side, the low carbon or the electric bus on the other, which I think is the sort of vision of public transportation. So what are some of the forces that I think are driving towards the latter scenario? I would say certainly climate-specific movements that are pushing for green public investment, like the Green New Deal. The top left is the Sunrise Movement protest for the Green New Deal. But also movements that aren't specifically oriented towards climate change or environmental issues. So teachers and nurses unions fighting for public investment in low carbon goods, like education and care. So in the bottom left, this is the LA teachers strike that happened a couple of years ago. Housing movements demanding housing for all. In the top right, we have the monster housing movement that took place in Oakland last year, but we could also add other movements for demanding homes guarantee, rent cancellation in the face of rent cancellation and eviction moratoria during the COVID crisis, and a number of other tenants unions and tenant organization projects. And of course, the bottom left, this is from Standing Rock, but anti-extractivist movements, which are both seeking to impede to prevent the use of conditions of production of sort of fossil, the conditions of fossil fuel production, and also seeking to defend the means of life quite literally, as in the actions of water protectors, seeking to protect, as we have the sign, water is life, making quite literal that argument, and protecting the means of life for humans as well as non-humans. So the second piece, and this is sort of my, I'm almost done, but the second piece is redirecting state coercion. And here, climate action is not only about investment, we also have to attend to the coercive power of the state. And at the present, the coercive power of the state is more often used to defend fossil capital than against it. So, I think we need to redirect that coercive power away from the repression of working class and racialized people and movements, and turn that coercive power on fossil capital. At present, again, the state defends privately owned fossil fuel infrastructure and fossil fuel resources, surveils activist organizations, criminalizes protests against fossil capital. In the wake of Standing Rock, a number of states have instituted laws with particularly harsh punishments for interference with critical infrastructure, by which they mean fossil fuel infrastructure. And does a number of other things. And it's on these grounds that Mann and Wainwright suggests that the state is likely one of our biggest obstacles. Consider, for example, what would have happened if to an anti-capitalist movement like Flood Wall Street, if it had actually threatened Wall Street. And I agree with this, but I think this is an argument, again, for the necessity of engaging with and struggling to transform the state. And I also simply think we have to use the coercive power of the state against fossil capital. As Mom argues, we have to declare war on the oil barons. um, that I think can look like a number of things, from banning fossil fuel extraction and export, regulating carbon-intensive industries, nationalizing fossil fuel reserves, and putting them on a path of what's sometimes called managed decline. Um, in some cases, the state must effectively destroy property values, the value of existing assets, by prohibiting the continued use of fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think in some areas, once we get into the terrain of asset devaluation, we can expect resistance even from fractions of capital that are competitive with fossil capital. When you infringe on assets, you make capital in general nervous. So here, where some of the forces that I think are at least pointing in the direction of, or starting to redirect, or aiming to redirect that state coercion. So again, anti-extractivist movements are usually, even though many use anti-state rhetoric, are often appealing to the state to reject permits for new fossil fuel infrastructure, and or to force fossil capital to keep it in the ground, to keep their assets in the ground, and for those to become, to lose their value. Moms call for a new age of sabotage against fossil fuel infrastructure, likewise argues for direct action as a spur to state repression of fossil capital rather than as a substitute for it. Only the state, he argues, can enforce prohibition on the use of fossil fuels and building a fossil fuel infrastructure at scale. So the challenge, of course, is how anti-extractive movements, which have been successful at stopping that, stopping fossil fuel infrastructure at the individual level, or level of individual projects, can scale that to stopping those projects more generally. But anti-extractive movements are also at the forefront of struggles against intensified repression, fighting back against state efforts to criminalize protests against fossil fuel infrastructure. As I mentioned, the Red Deal, the indigenous vision for a climate platform, begins with a demand for divestment from police, La Migra, prison and military, and calls instead for public investments in free housing, education, healthcare, and transportation. A similar argument for simultaneously putting an end to state repression, and instead using state capacities for public investment, comes from the Black Lives Matter movement, typically not thought of as a climate movement, but which also similarly makes a crucial argument for dismantling state repression of obviously racialized communities in particular, but also for calling attention to state spending priorities and redirecting that spending towards things like education and housing. So we have a sort of another call for reorienting the state. So, you know, as I think all of these challenges I've raised suggest, and some of the critiques I've raised suggest, transforming the state is not going to be easy. It's not something that anti-capitalist movements can pick up and use. But I think it is something that we have to figure out how to engage. And so I've tried to outline here why I think this is both necessary and possible, if not likely, and some of the forces that I think are beginning to lead the way in the direction that we need, even while attending to the many challenges which face us. So I'm going to just leave it there for now. I look forward to your questions and comments, and I'm sure it'll be a great discussion. So thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alyssa, for an incredibly rich and stimulating talk. As a general guide here to what will proceed, we have some time for questions. And so please enter your questions into the chat box, and we will allow Alyssa to respond to them one by one. I think everyone can see the chat, and so you can read the questions for yourselves, and I will not repeat them to you. While we're giving everyone a moment to type something into the chat, Alyssa, perhaps I can start by asking you a question or two. I have quite a few that it was a really stimulating talk. But let me start with the 2 points with which you concluded, which I might call a kind of the minimal program that falls from your theory. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, like, I take it to mean, like you're saying, this would be from which we can find a kind of coalition. So if we think about those 2 points which you mentioned, the transforming state investment, so it's no longer a fossil fuel state, and redirecting state coercion, so it's no longer a kind of war machine against the minoritized, the people of color, women, the poor, and so on. It's a minimal program, but actually, I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say it's well beyond the capacity of the left, just about anywhere in the world, to achieve either one of these goals right now. So there is a sense in which your strategy also could be labeled utopian, and I'm kind of I mean that in a friendly way. Like, I think, in other words, there's a fair question to ask, like, how do we actually do that? If we think as Poulansians of the state as a social relation, and we're trying to look for levers and points of contradiction within the state to push against, what social forces do you find that actually exist today that we could work with to magnify the contradictions to achieve those 2 goals, practically speaking? And I'm not necessarily just thinking of the United States here, but you could take that as your frame of reference if that's helpful. Okay, let's turn it over to Alyssa to try and answer that question, or to say what she will. I know she has a lot to say, but don't forget, everyone, type your questions into the chat, or else you'll be stuck listening to my questions. Over to you, Alyssa.
Well, thank you. It is a great question, and I do agree that I agree with the basic point that it's that these many of these things seem utopian from the perspective of is this like a likely thing that's going to happen in the near term. I guess one of the distinctions I'm trying to make here, at least, is try to step back a little bit from like what is the exact what is exact configuration of the balance of forces right now, like where is power on the left and amongst left movements right now, even though I think those are absolutely crucial, and maybe I shouldn't have ended there, but I am trying to step back a little bit and think, do I think this is like constitutively impossible, or the state is constitutionally impossible, of incapable, like, or unusable by left movements, or is there at least some possibility at a sort of more abstract level? And if there is, well, how can we start to look for those sort of potential forces and cracks? And so it's so I guess it's I'm aware that it's none of the movements that I've named or sort of forces I'm looking to are sort of immediately in a position to sort of carry out this program. And that is a problem because, I think on the one hand, I'm trying to take this at a more abstract level, but I'm also saying we need to do this quite quickly. So, but I think this is also where, frankly, I think that, I talked less about the kind of fractions of capital piece, but I do think that the sort of rush of investment into renewable technologies, I think this is a place where like green capital is not really going to help us shut down the fossil fuel industry, but I think does present more opportunities for like trying to direct where that investment goes. So I think that's a place, and the tensions between the interests of sort of fossil capital and green capital is, I think, something we really have to think about and try to push on. I guess like killing your more immediate enemy off first, and trying to again build, to use some of what might be the if we can direct some of that funding and investment into at least a partial version of the program I outlined, oriented towards means of life. I don't think we're going to get everything at once, but I think some of the idea of what we tried to outline in the Green New Deal book, for example, was how you can win at least pieces of this program, and thereby sort of fuel a building of it. And I think that's where this idea or argument for non-reformist reforms in her recent piece, I think is an important one in terms of like, how do we take this not as an all or nothing program, but a piece by piece.
Thank you, Alyssa. Well, so I just want to nudge everyone again to type your questions into the chat. I know you have questions. I hope that you're not blocked from typing in the chat. If that's so, hopefully we can remove the barriers and let the people speak. But in the meantime, a follow-up remark, Alyssa. Everything you just said makes perfect sense to me, and I think that I'm totally in agreement. And so I wonder if perhaps part of what is causing those of us within, let's say, the green Marxist community a bit of difficulty is that we're criticizing one another using the term utopian as if it's a negative phenomenon, when all of us, like Romain Rolland would remind us, are desperately in need of utopian horizons today, because otherwise one is not going to be mobilizing people pragmatically towards these victories. So on that note, I thought your reference to Amna's dialectic of radical ideation and power building was really powerful. And in that regard, I wonder, if would you be open to the possibility that radical ideation on the radical left today, in the spirit of your analysis, could and should include anti-state forms of organizing? And would that necessarily take the form of dual power, or could it look like something else? I think that might be part of what is causing some confusion here. And then after that, I'll say that Amna put a question in.
Well, I'll answer the first, and then I'll get to Amna's. But yeah, that's a great point and question, and I think it is helpful in sort of thinking about framing, because I think it does get to this question of how to. I mean, both certainly. I don't want to just be dumping on utopian proposals, because I agree completely that we need utopian proposals. I think it's how to also translate those into that middle realm of pushing the boundaries of realism while trying to be somewhat pragmatic. And I don't know, I think some part of the problem is also, I think that we probably all have different views about where exactly that borderline is, or like where what it means to be pushing the boundaries versus to be sort of like just, thinking just in the realm of radical imagination, and how to connect those. So a lot of it does, there's only so much maybe you can do at the level of abstraction, and some of it comes down to concrete concrete proposal, but also at times and places. And I think this is one of the challenges for me as a political theorist who is also very interested in like movements and organizing, and I think organizing, having done a lot of it, is not something that you can't say this is going to work, or this is the strategy, or this is the horizon even in advance. A lot of that emerges from what you're actually doing. So so insofar as that is the case, yeah, I think I think as a horizon, I definitely think, well, I certainly think that even in the sort of that a lot of forms of anti-state, many anti-state movements and forms of critique are actually very important as a part of this kind of general, balance of forces I'm trying to sketch. And maybe some of them would be angry to say like that, like this to be mobilized as part of my argument for why we have to use the state or transform the state in a certain way. And so I can recognize that, because I know that a lot of many anti-extractivist movements, certainly elements of the the movements that are against state repression are also major. I think it would classify as anti-state in a significant way. And so I think that there are aspects of those that are also trying to, again, redirect the state, or saying we want this thing and not that thing, but other people just don't want the state at all. And so, that also, there's a challenge in composition there too. But I would rather not force that. Like I want to accept that as part of the horizon. I think we're not sort of close enough to the horizon to start to say that shouldn't be part of our vision and what we're trying to work out. Because I don't, in many ways, know what I think the state should look like after capitalism. I think it would have to look very different if it exists. And so that's why I really do want to be in conversation with the sort of with the anti-state position, and even in maybe especially in its most utopian aspects.
Here. Okay, on that note, a point of order. I have been telling everyone to type your questions into the chat, forgetting completely there's a function called question and answer. Fortunately, Amna, who's written the first question, has placed it in both locations. In the future, you can use question and answer. So go ahead, Alyssa, if you can see Amna's question, perhaps you can take it on.
Yeah. So I'll just read it out.
I think it's a good idea.
So the question is, curious to hear about your take on the politics and strategies and seeming centrality of Sunrise and its politics, which seem increasingly turned towards electoral politics and less organizing, at least according to Jane McAlevey, the labor organizer and theorist, and more mobilizing. What do you see as their role in the ecosystem? So this is a great question, and I will answer it. I'll answer the best I can, since I'm not sort of close enough into Sunrise and what they're doing to have a great view. But I will at least say that does seem to be my that's also my perception, that they've certainly gone from kind of a couple of years ago a more direct action in the sense of going and occupying Nancy Pelosi's office and sort of raising a ruckus as the main mode of protest, to now adopting a more electoral strategy, which I think has made sense for the past several months or so. I'm kind of curious where it will go now. So I think it made sense in the midst of a major electoral push, that was, or a moment of electoral politics, that was where they were focusing. The idea that we were not going to get, that none of the sort of Sunrise goals would be met under a Trump administration seemed like true. But I am concerned, I guess, that some of the more antagonistic and disruptive force of Sunrise in its earlier days might get diluted and kind of domesticated, although I don't love using that as a term for like tamed, but domesticated into something more that is about trying to elect people, but also to secure favor amongst elected officials, and trying not to offend too much, trying to to work, I guess, to use the parlance, within the system rather than pushing from outside, trying to be too much on the side of like, we've won some amount of state power, let's work within the state and forget the kind of buildup of social forces beyond and outside it. So I am a bit concerned about that, and it has been sort of concerning to see the more generally just the number of conversations that seem in recent even since the election to come down to what will Biden do on climate, and the focus on very much like the Biden administration's like internal plans for climate change, which again, it's like pretty recently off a major election, but still, I worry that it is back to the question of horizons, shrinking our horizons a bit, and shrinking the kinds of activities people are doing. I don't know as much about their organizing strategy, but I do think we could use a lot more McAlevey style organizing across a lot of movements. So I actually just read a really interesting report from the DC DSA's like housing committee. So they've been doing a lot of tenant organizing in DC, and they started off, I think, just trying to like, I don't know what their original strategy was, but they tried to start taking more of a labor organizing model of organizing, and to really build the kinds of relationships that that labor organizing traditionally uses, and to build more of a structure and do a lot of the kinds of tests. And it seems like they've had a lot of success with that. And it's housing movements, I think, are not. So I guess the idea is just being that the McAlevey model, or that vision of deep organizing, is I think is something that can be applied to a lot of other movements, and I think should be. And I would be excited to see that happening more broadly, along the lines of what this DC DSA report laid out. But yeah, I can't speak to their sort of internal model.
If I could interject briefly, Alyssa, thanks for the answer. So the time is now 4:45, and this is our traditional time for beginning to wrap things up. So if you have to go, don't feel any shame by hitting the little red leave button. But since we have Alyssa here, and I'm sure there are some of us, other than myself, who have more questions to ask, and I think Alyssa, can you stick around for another 15 minutes or so?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I thought we were going to 5, so I'm sorry if I.
No problem at all. Yeah, well then I'll take that as a yes. So Ben McKean, political theorist here at Ohio State, just wrote, great talk. A few questions. Does the need for global coordination to reduce emissions change how we should think strategically about the state? It seems to me that the strategy of seeking electoral support for the Green New Deal has led to a focus on finding domestic constituencies who will support it. But what opportunities for transnational alliances, if any, do you think are opened up by a Marxist climate politics? That's the first question. There's another one standing behind it. Over to you, Alyssa.
Yes, great. Well, I might just answer both of them. Well, I'll start with the first one, but I do think they're pertinent, and the second one's actually, I think it's something that I probably should have said more about. But hi Ben, thank you for coming. And yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's something I've been thinking about. On the one hand, I think it's actually important that there's been a shift more towards building. I guess the attempt to build sort of a domestic constituency for climate action is an important shift away from the just come to a global agreement at the UN level model of of the UN climate accords, and then we'll get to an agreement and something will happen, or that's been very focused on the UN model. So I think there's something important there that's trying to think about, well, what would this look like on the ground? I think there's been some interesting political science work suggesting that actually is that some of the global collective action problem aspect is overstated and that really a lot of the barriers are about trying to get to that, deal with some of the, what this paper calls distributive problems around what climate action would entail within states. Although, of course, I think on some level you can't really separate entirely the domestic from the international, because domestic policy, always has an international component and vice versa. I do think that transnational alliances, I think the thing I really didn't talk about in this at all was the role of the state in international, how states act with respect to other states, and whether in international climate talks or international trade agreements, and sort of how we think about the state in that role. And I think that certainly one place that we need to think about, I guess, from a sort of Marxist climate politics perspective, is what to do about all of these trade agreements that in which the various the relationships of global supply chains are enshrined, and which are determinative of at least some of the, or set some of the constraints around how states are going to and can act. And so that's less on what the alliances are and more about one place that I think a Marxist climate politics thinking about the state has to go. I do think in terms of transnational alliances, well, I don't want to say too much here because I don't think I probably have a full answer there, but it's something that I agree is a really crucial point. I guess I should just say something out. Should I read out the second half of that question? All right, so your talk offered reflection largely on the state in general, even though specific cases concerned opportunities with US politics as the hegemonic role of the US state in global politics change how we think about its function in relation to capital and the opportunities for transformation available within it. My short answer is yes. I think this is exactly right. And I do think that there's some of the aspects of US politics, I think, are replicated elsewhere. For example, some of the struggles around anti-extractivism, as I think you can see similar dynamics play out in, for example, my co-author Theo Francos's work on resource politics in Ecuador, resource radicals. So I think there are dimensions that we might say well, I see similar struggles taking place here and there, but I think that the role of the US state is distinctive, and I think that makes, in many ways, action within the state both more necessary and more difficult. And that's not just because the US is a major carbon emitter, although it is, but I think more importantly, other aspects of either its role in certainly, I think, well, to take, for example, the role of the US state and the Federal Reserve in the 2008 financial crisis, I think the financial crisis actually reveals the very disparate roles of different states in the global economy, and thinking about globalization in many ways. I think the problem is less that no states have power, but that some states have, occupied these nodal positions within a global regime of capital accumulation where they have a distinctive role, have power that other states don't have, and so and those are still subject to internal political decision making. I think if you read Crash, Adam Teese's history of the financial crisis, it looks like, if you look at the financial crisis, it looks like a very kind of capitalist state stepping in to save capitalism, bail out banks, not homeowners, and so on. But he makes the case that it's a much more contingent, political situation, that the response is itself political and relied on these coalitions that decided how and when to use the Fed, but also fiscal policy to rescue the global economy. So all of that is to say that I think that means, can you just then deploy those tools to attack the climate crisis? No, they're not the same. It's not the same kind of crisis. And I think actually the disparity between the 2008 financial crisis and the climate crisis is sort of evidence to that disjuncture between economic and ecological crises that somebody like Burkett and Foster might point to. But in any case, there are aspects of US politics that I think condition the role that the US plays within the global politics, the global economic order, and that is, again, makes it, I think, particularly important to take on, but also, very difficult to do.
That leads into the next question, Alyssa, which came through the chat, and it comes from Sher Khan. The question is, how do you view recent critiques of the Green New Deal, both as an anti-capitalist strategy, but in terms of the global South?
Would that question be about the global South, like the sort of extractive dimensions of green technologies?
Perhaps you share, Khan, if you're listening, perhaps you could clarify by adding to your question in the chat. There we are. Can you see that, Alyssa?
Yes. Is the comment from Nancy Ettlinger?
Sorry, yeah, this is a new question from Nancy Ettlinger, and perhaps we can come back to Sher Khan's question once we have a clarification. So Nancy writes, thank you for an interesting presentation. Would you comment on the problems of replacing the extraction of fossil fuel with the problems of extraction of, for instance, lithium required for plans for electrification of transportation and communication per the Green New Deal?
Sure. Yeah. My first comment is that there are a number of problems. This is one of the chapters of our Green New Deal book tries to really focus on this, is the idea that we're just greening the economy is really not a good way to think about it, because lithium extraction comes with its own environmental and social problems and costs. And so I think one of the things that we try to, well, I think there are a couple of things. One of them is that it's not, we need to, I think both for reasons of sort of speed and justice, reduce energy use, as well as not just give everyone a new, replace every single, fossil fuel combustion car with an electric vehicle, but actually try to, again, like, use these forms of collective consumption. So if you need a lot less lithium if people are getting around with electric bus than if everyone has an electric vehicle. So some of it is about reducing energy use in places like the US, which are very high energy consumers. But then I think another piece is around what the conditions of extraction are. Some of those are things that I think depend on struggles taking place in places where lithium is mined. So in the book, we look at Chile, and that's based on my co-author Thea Riofrancos's field work there. But so some of it is going to be dependent on what happens there. It's not necessarily something that we can sort of dictate the terms of. But I do think this is another place where things like thinking about how environmental and labor protections are or are not built into our trade agreements and are or are not enforced along supply chains is really important. Going back to Ben's question about sort of global aspects of this problem.
Tal Shutkin has written with a question. Outside of the United States, we are seeing the growth of coalition governments aligning far-right parties with conventional Greens. Working within the state, how can we be sure that the more radical aspects of a climate justice agenda aren't erased under such conditions?
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that's been very interesting and worrisome to see, because I think here the far right is so anti-green, I guess, or it's the far right has not taken the kind of green turn that I think it has more in Europe and elsewhere. But I think that I find concerning, not only for erasing the more radical aspects of the climate justice agenda, but for erasing kind of the justice aspects of the climate justice agenda. Because I think if you're aligning with the far right, I think you start to lose a concept of what exactly that justice is. And that's why I think it's important to emphasize the different ways that decarbonization might play out, and that is the product of, in part, what kind of balance of forces are aligning. So I would say, I think this is also partly why we can't only work within the state, and why the kind of buildup of movements and social forces outside the state is also really crucial. Of course, that can happen on the right too. Like the right has its own buildup of social forces and movements, and it's not like that's the solution. But I think it's we can't just say, okay, well, we elected some Greens and some Democratic Socialists, and now they'll just hash it out. Not that anyone here is saying we should do that. I'm sure that's not what many of us think, but that you can never lose sight of the need to have that that external, the struggle is happening inside and outside.
Very good. And we received a clarification from Sher Khan, thank you, who you'll recall asked earlier about criticisms of the Green New Deal coming from the Global South. Sher Khan clarifies, pointing to the fact that social democracy is a compromise with capital, and capital has its roots in colonialism and imperialism.
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose, I certainly think it's, I understand the critique of the Green New Deal as a sort of compromise position, or that it's not a fully anti-capitalist position. And obviously that comes with all of the, that remaining within capitalism comes with all of the, both historical and present violences of capitalism. And I suppose to that, I don't, I guess I just go back to the question of the horizon. Like, I don't think that social democracy is the compromise that we're looking for. It's like it's, I guess, the transitional program in a way, but it's not even, in some sense it's, often the critique of social democracy is that it does have this very incrementalist view. And so there's something kind of funny about trying to use what would be kind of a social democratic framework as the push for a quicker transition, or for moving beyond it. But in any case, I don't mean it to be like, this is what we should do and this is what we should institute. And certainly not in the form, certainly the 20th century social democracy is hard to disentangle from not only colonialism and imperialism, but what we now think of as a great acceleration of resource use and ecological devastation. So, social democracy as it has existed is not the horizon. And I don't even think social democracy as it's existed is the stepping stone in many ways. It's, even if there are some elements that we might think of as social democratic.
Very good. Well, on that note, thank you for taking on all these questions, Alyssa, and for providing an incredibly stimulating talk. And thanks to all of you who came to attend today's lecture. Don't forget that in 2 weeks, we'll be back for another great talk provided by Mary Thomas from our own Ohio State University. That's the same time, 2 weeks from today. And you can find more details on the website of the Department of Geography. So typically, Alyssa, this is when we give you an enormous round of applause. But unfortunately, in this COVID era, we can't do so. But on behalf of everyone you've reached today, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I wish you all the best as you continue to carry out this very important work.
Thank you
All
so
the
much
best.
for the invitation, and thank you all for coming and for great questions. I really enjoyed it. So
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks, everyone, and see you in 2 weeks.